Hi, today we will explain the storyline of the movie A Guy Thing, which was released in 2003. Okay, let's get straight to the story. One night, Paul celebrates a bachelor party with his friends and closest family members at a bar. He was going to marry the woman he loved, Karen, in a few days. At the party, Paul met a tiki dancer named Becky, and in a state of half-drunk, Paul spent the rest of the night without remembering what he did last night. The next morning, Paul was very surprised to see Becky in bed with him. Suddenly, Paul's mother-in-law, Sandra, called to inform him that Karen was on her way to his apartment. Paul then sent Becky away, who was also surprised to find out that Paul was getting married. Unfortunately, Becky couldn't find her underwear, so Paul promised to send it to Becky if he found it. He then escorted Becky to the door, where his neighbor, Pastor Ferris, his wife, and their son, saw Becky and Paul. Their son was suddenly stunned to see Becky's rather revealing outfit. Paul finally made his excuse and said that Becky was just a marriage lawyer. After Becky left, Paul continued his search and managed to find Becky's underwear. He, who was still very panicked, then stored Becky's underwear in the toilet seat water tank. Just then, Karen came over and asked how the party had gone the night before. Paul, of course, didn't tell her the truth because Karen would have a fit. They then discussed the final preparations for their wedding, such as the clothes Paul would wear at the rehearsal dinner and the wedding music. Karen felt something was wrong because Paul seemed surprised to see her, but Paul dodged the question and replied that he was still hungover from drinking the night before. Karen didn't comment further and just believed him. Long story short, after Karen left, Paul went to see his friend Jim, who was also at the bachelor party. Without further ado, he asked what happened last night and told him about Becky's presence this morning. He thought about telling Karen, but Jim did not support his intention. He even asked Paul to keep it a secret and consider it a natural experience. Paul also blamed Jim for including the tiki dancer girl at the party. However, Jim tried to calm him down because he was sure Paul would not meet the girl again. However, Jim's guess was wrong, because the next day, when Paul was on his way to the office, Paul met Becky, who now works as a toll gate attendant. Becky claimed not to be a dancer anymore, and the two of them seemed nervous, so that Becky almost messed up her first day of work. Shortly afterwards, Paul arrived at the office of Ken, Paul's boss and father-in-law. That day, they were going to hold a meeting with the whole team. Before the meeting started, they had a private conversation and discussed Paul's bachelor party. Just like he did with Karen, Paul claimed that the party was just normal, but as a fellow man, Ken implied that he knew what might have happened there. Furthermore, during the meeting, Ken asked Paul to give a presentation, but suddenly Paul felt a strong itch in his crotch. He tried desperately to hide the itching during the presentation, but, unable to bear it, he went to the toilet to check. After the meeting, Paul hurried to the pharmacy to buy medicine. But unexpectedly, Sandra, Paul's mother-in-law, appeared at the same pharmacy. Sandra also did not expect to meet Paul, but Paul then tried to distract Sandra and change the subject. Just then, Jeff the pharmacist appeared and handed Paul the necessary medication while mentioning the name of his illness. Paul then told Sandra that Jeff was a good cook and praised Jeff's crab dishes. Sandra didn't realize that they were bragging and instead invited Jeff to cook at Paul and Karen's rehearsal dinner. Jeff immediately agreed because Sandra was willing to pay a pretty penny. That evening, Sandra and Ken had a simple dinner with Paul's family, and she also told Dorothy and Buck, Paul's parents, about Jeff. While their parents were chatting with each other, Karen invited Paul to meet Karen's cousin, who was unexpectedly Becky. Paul suddenly ran away, hiding in the distance when he saw Becky so that Becky didn't have time to see his face. Karen also looked for Paul and found him pretending to sleep in the upstairs room. Even though Paul's reason sounded absurd, Karen tried to ignore him. She still wanted to introduce Paul to Becky, who happened to be going upstairs to get her bag. Paul reflexively hid again and avoided Becky. Paul finally found a way to escape quietly from the bathroom window, but he landed in Ken's car, which automatically set off the car alarm. Ken was annoyed and thought his car was going to be stolen. But when he was outside, Ken thought it was just a raccoon. Karen then returned home to check if Paul was okay in the bathroom, and Paul assured them that he had diarrhea. A few minutes passed, the event was finally over, and then Paul came out. He thought all the guests had gone home, including Becky, but suddenly Becky came back because something had been left behind. Since there was no way to avoid it, Paul resigned himself when Karen introduced him to Becky, and they both shook hands awkwardly, as if it were the first time they had met. After Becky went home, Karen said that Becky was behaving strangely. She often changed jobs, and now she was even working in a music store. Karen also felt sympathy for Becky, who had just broken up with her boyfriend, Ray. Ray was a policeman who behaved abusively and narcissistically, but Karen was relieved that they had broken up. The next day, Paul told his brother, Pete, about the embarrassing incident. Pete told Paul he was stupid, and also scared Paul that Becky might reveal their secret when she made a drunken speech at the wedding. Hearing that possibility, Paul tried to convince himself that it would not happen, but it kept bothering him. After stopping by the shop to try on wedding dresses, Paul went to where Becky worked. Here, Becky revealed that they didn't actually sleep together. They just slept in the same bed, but didn't do anything. Paul was relieved on the one hand, but on the other hand, he was confused because he had accused Becky of giving him lice. Becky was suddenly upset to hear the accusation. She also suggested another possibility that Paul might have caught it from the toilet seat. Paul then remembered that he had bumped into one of his friends at a bachelorette party on his way to the toilet. Paul was convinced that his friend was the culprit, and he asked Becky to promise not to say anything to Karen or mess up his wedding. Paul then practiced waltz dancing with Karen. Long story short, a few hours later, Karen drove him home and told Paul to wait while she looked for parking. Suddenly, Ray appeared and beat Paul from behind.
That's my car!
Then he showed him photos of Becky and Paul together at a bachelor party. Ray felt very jealous and assaulted Paul on the spot. Paul then threw the photo in the trash, but unbeknownst to him, Pastor Ferris's son took the photo. After that, Karen accompanied Paul to report the unpleasant incident to the police. However, Paul could not give an honest description of the person who attacked him. If he was honest, everything would be exposed, so he made up a physical description of the man who attacked him and the incident. Shortly afterwards, the police left to follow up on Paul's report, while Karen went to the bathroom. How surprised Paul was when Karen returned with Becky's underwear that was found in the toilet water tank. Karen suddenly accused Paul of sleeping with another woman, but stammering, Paul made up another story that he had bought the underwear for Karen. Paul dodged that he intended to give it to her later, but Karen shuddered in disgust realizing the underwear was dirty. Karen also tried to get him to talk honestly, but Paul stuck to his story. So Karen called the store that sold the underwear to complain that they were selling dirty underwear. Unexpectedly, the employee who received the complaint offered to replace the new product. Although at first the employee was confused and offended, but she secretly understood that it was a guy thing. After the phone call, Karen felt guilty for accusing Paul and apologized to him. However, Paul's problem was not over just like that. Suddenly, Paul's neighbor, Pastor Ferris, who was none other than the father of the boy who lived in the apartment next door, knocked on Paul's room. He held Paul accountable for allegedly spreading indecent photos that his son had found in the trash. Surprised, Paul immediately hid the photo in his pants while Karen followed to greet the guest. After Ferris left, Paul went to the toilet to burn the photo.
Bullshit!
But Karen smelled something burning from the toilet, so Paul panicked and threw it out the window. Unfortunately, Ferris's son found the photo again, so Ferris was forced to return the photos with a little threat. Not only that, Becky also called Paul to tell him what his ex, Ray, was up to. So she invited Paul to sneak into Ray's apartment and take a photo negative while Ray was working overtime later that night. Paul pretended to be talking to Jim on the phone so that Karen wouldn't be suspicious. After the phone was hung up, it rang again. Karen hurriedly picked it up because she wanted to talk to Jim. But luckily, this time Jim really called. After talking for a while, Karen handed the phone to Paul. On the other line, the police reported that they had arrested several criminals matching Paul's description the other day. Although surprised, Paul went to the police station to make sure that none of the criminals were the culprit. That night, he and Becky went to Ray's apartment. As expected, Ray wasn't home, but Becky forgot to mention that Ray had a dog. So they had to move extra carefully so as not to wake the dog, but unfortunately the dog woke up when it heard something fall. They hurriedly ran to the bathroom and waited for Ray's dog to get tired, but the dog loyally waited for them to come out. After waiting a few minutes, Becky finally suggested that they trap the dog in the bathroom stall. And luckily this plan worked so that Becky could get the negative photo they were looking for. They also escaped from the emergency stairwell. On the way home, Paul and Becky became closer and felt happy with their success tonight. After dropping Becky off, Paul continued on his way. But unfortunately, halfway there, Ray followed Paul and took him to the police station. This time, he made false accusations that Paul was a drug dealer to his colleagues. He also smuggled illegal drugs into Paul's car to make them believe. Long story short, Ray's colleague took Paul to the interrogation room, where they ended up chatting all night. The next morning, 2 internal affairs agents came to Paul and said that they knew Paul was innocent, but Paul couldn't just go home. They asked for Paul's cooperation in arresting Ray. At first, Paul refused because he didn't want any hassle with his wedding being one day away, but he finally agreed to have them attach a wiretap to his body. Paul finally went home for the rehearsal dinner. Even though it was late, but he tried his best to speed up to the dinner venue. As planned, Jeff the pharmacist was there to cook their dinner, but unbeknownst to them, Jeff put marijuana in one of the dishes just in case the food didn't taste good. As a result, almost all the guests at the dinner table acted strangely. In the middle of the event, Paul felt something was different about his feelings, especially when listening to Karen and Pete's conversation, which felt fluid and connected. Paul then noticed Becky and realized that he felt more comfortable when he was with Becky. Sometime later, when Paul returned home, he was surprised to see Ray had entered his apartment. Here, Ray admitted himself that he was a cunning policeman who had a myriad of tricks to frame innocent people. Ray attacked Paul and made him surrender, unable to fight back. But not long after, two policemen arrested Ray and handed over the recording evidence from the wiretap. The next day was Paul's wedding day, and he felt very nervous and anxious. He confided in his brother that all the problems that had befallen him in the past few days had been resolved one by one, but he had forgotten one thing, which was to hire a wedding party. He called Jim to sort this out, but unexpectedly, Karen's father, Ken, came out of the toilet. He had heard all of Paul's outpouring of emotion just now, but he would not criticize anything and understood it as a guy thing. The small obstacles had not just been resolved. In the minutes leading up to Karen walking down the aisle, she found out that the wedding musicians were not up to expectations. In addition, the priest who was to marry them was also replaced by Reverend Ferris because the previous priest was ill. However, the damage was already done. Karen had to accept the reality. Towards the end of the blessing, Ferris invited anyone who wanted to raise objections to Karen and Paul's marriage. After waiting for several minutes, Paul himself raised his hand, which of course made everyone stunned. Slowly, Paul said that he didn't feel like he fit in with Karen and didn't want to marry her. After expressing his objection, Pete stepped forward and sang a song they both liked. Pete also confessed that he was in love with Karen, then he proposed to Karen on the spot. Without thinking twice, Karen immediately accepted the proposal and agreed to date first before getting married. The relief wasn't just for the two of them, because after returning from church, Paul chased after Becky and expressed his feelings.